Welcome back, everybody. We trust that your time reflecting on the work of Christ is helping your group grow in faith together. We now want to turn to our final section of primeval history. This lesson shows how Moses structured God's covenant with Noah and the way in which humanity responded to the instructions in it. We hope this lesson gives insight into a largely neglected part of the book and that it helps clear up some common confusion in this portion of Scripture.
I recall a time when I was teaching in the Ukraine and had only a few minutes to reach my destination by metro. I rushed to the station, ran down the stairs, and jumped on the train just as the doors were closing. It was going to be a long ride, all the way across town, so I sat back to catch my breath and relax for a few minutes. Then, after a while, it suddenly dawned on me that I had taken the train going in the wrong direction. Now, naturally, the next metro station was miles away, and it took forever to reach it. By the time I got turned around and started back, it was clear that I was going to be very late. I can remember thinking to myself, well, this situation isn't all that I hoped it would be, but at least now I'm going in the right direction. I guess that's the way it is in most areas of life. Our situations are never perfect, and most of the time they're not even close. We face lots of problems and challenges everywhere we go, yet we all know that it is still better at least to be going in the right direction rather than the wrong way. We've entitled this lesson, The Right Direction, and in it we are going to explore Genesis chapter 6 verse 9 through chapter 11 verse 9, where we'll discover the direction God established for His people to follow after the great flood in the days of Noah. As we will see, in these chapters of the primeval history, Moses gave the people of Israel a clear direction to pursue. It may not have been all that they wanted, but it was ordained by God to bring them toward great blessings. And this portion of the primeval history is very important for Christians too, because we should be following this same direction as well. Our study of Genesis chapter 6 verse 9 through chapter 11 verse 9 will divide into three parts. First, we will examine the literary structure of these chapters. Second, we'll explore their original meaning by discerning why Moses wrote this material for Israel. And third, we will look to the New Testament for guidance in applying these chapters to our lives. Let's begin our study of the right direction by exploring the literary structure of these chapters. Genesis chapter 6 verse 9 through chapter 11 verse 9 is a large portion of the primeval history, and it may be outlined in a number of different ways. For our purposes, we have segmented these chapters into two main parts. The first section includes chapter 6 verse 9 through chapter 9 verse 17. And we have entitled it, The Flood of Deliverance. In this part of Genesis, Moses described the flood of Noah's day. The second part of this material is Genesis chapter 9, verse 18 through chapter 11, verse 9, which we have entitled, The New Order. It describes several crucial events that took place after the flood, and which set enduring patterns that characterized the world after the flood. To gain a better understanding of the literary pattern of these chapters, we will look into both of these major parts. Let's begin by examining the structure of the story Moses wrote about the flood of Noah's day. In recent years, a number of interpreters have noticed that the story of Noah's flood displays a relatively clear literary pattern. Although it's possible to describe this pattern in a number of ways, in this study, we will point out how these chapters form a symmetrical five-step drama. The first step of this narrative appears in Genesis chapter 6, verses 9 through 22, and we will call it the initial divine covenant with Noah. In this portion of the narrative, Moses noted that Noah was a righteous man in a world that had gone sour. God spoke to Noah and revealed why he planned to destroy the human race. We read these words in Genesis chapter 6, verse 13. So God said to Noah, I am going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I am surely going to destroy both them and the earth. Yet the first step of this narrative also tells us that God planned to start over again by delivering one man and his family, namely righteous Noah. To assure Noah of his intention, God entered into an initial covenant with Noah. In Genesis chapter 6, verses 17 and 18, we read that God said these words to Noah: "Everything on earth will perish, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark, you and your sons, and your wife and your sons' wives with you." At the beginning of the flood narrative, God swore a covenant oath to rescue Noah and his family from the coming flood. This covenant secured Noah's deliverance and established him as the head of a new humanity after the flood. Now that we've seen how the flood story opens by focusing on God's initial covenant with Noah, we should turn to the last portion of the story, which balances the first, chapter 8, verse 20, through chapter 9, verse 17, which we have entitled The Enduring Divine Covenant with Noah. As our title suggests, in this passage, God returned to Noah after the flood and made another covenant with him. God decided to give humanity the opportunity of a new order in the world. As we read in Genesis chapter 8, verse 22, "As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease." To establish the certainty of this new course, God entered into a second covenant with Noah at the end of the flood narrative in Genesis chapter 9, verses 11 through 15. "I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I bring clouds over the earth and the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will remember my covenant between me and you and all living creatures of every kind." So we see that the story of Noah's flood ends with the covenant promise that a flood will never again destroy the earth, and with God setting his bow in the clouds as a sure sign that he would never forget this promise. This closing covenant promise points to the great importance that Noah had in the primeval history. He was the mediator of a covenant which extended to all future generations. With the opening and closing sections of this story in mind, we're in a position to explore the inner workings of the flood narrative. The middle portion moves from God's initial covenant to the new order of the final covenant in three main steps. The second step of this narrative appears in chapter 7, verses 1 through 16, which we have entitled Noah's Escape from Water. This material is rather straightforward. Noah prepared the ark and brought animals of every kind into it, and flood waters began to burst into the world. But Noah, his family, and the animals he had gathered were safely sealed in the ark. The fourth section of the story of Noah's flood forms a dramatic counterpoint to the second step. It describes Noah's exit to dry land in Genesis chapter 8, verses 6 through 19. After the flood had begun to subside, Noah longed for dry land to appear so that he could leave the ark. After a period of waiting, dry lands appeared, and God commanded Noah to leave the ark just as he had previously ordered him to enter it. Now we're in a position to look at the center or turning point of this narrative, Genesis chapter 7, verse 17 through chapter 8, verse 5, which we have entitled The Divine Remembrance of Noah. These verses begin with a description of the flood raging and destroying every living thing on earth. But by the end of this section, the flood has begun to subside. Now, at the very heart of this part of the story is a simple but profound sentence which indicates why God began to calm the raging flood. In Genesis chapter 8, verse 1, Moses wrote that in the midst of the storm, God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. In great mercy, God did not forget the covenant he made with Noah and those with him. He remembered the passengers of the ark and moved on their behalf against the raging flood. This outline of Noah's flood brings to light the primary concerns of the story. Moses wrote about the flood as a story of deliverance. Although judgment came on the wicked of the earth, Moses' chief concern was to show that through Noah, God brought humanity into a world of tremendous blessings. Now that we've explored the first portion of Genesis chapter 6 verse 9 through chapter 11 verse 9, we should turn to the second major section, the new order, in Genesis chapter 9 verse 18 through chapter 11 verse 9. Moses' account of the new order in chapters 9 through 11 divides into two basic units. On the one hand, Genesis chapter 9 verse 18 through chapter 10 verse 32 focuses on the sons of Noah. On the other hand, Genesis chapter 11 verses 1 through 9 concern the defeat of the city of Babel. Although these passages may seem unrelated at first, we will see that they actually work together to create a pattern for the new order of the world. They set forth the central features of world history from that time forward. Let's look first at the account of the sons of Noah and the contribution it makes to this portrait of the newly ordered world. Moses' record of the sons of Noah in chapters 9 and 10 of Genesis consists of a title and two main sections. In chapter 9, verses 18 and 19, we find a title which indicates that this portion of Genesis focuses primarily on Noah's three sons and how they were distributed over the earth. In line with this title, Moses' record of Noah's sons divides into two main sections. In the first place, the story in chapter 9, verses 20 through 29 sets forth distinctions among the sons. And in the second place, chapter 10, verses 1 through 32 describe the distribution of Noah's sons and their descendants. It will be helpful to look at these sections separately. Chapter 9, verses 20 through 29 is that well-known passage in Genesis that speaks of the curse on Ham's son, Canaan. Listen to what Moses wrote in Genesis chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. When Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth." Put simply, this narrative reports the events that led to a major distinction among the descendants of Noah. Noah cursed Canaan, the son of Ham. Canaan would be the lowest of slaves to his brothers. Yet Noah pronounced blessings on his other sons, Shem and Japheth, because they had treated him with respect. Moses included this story in his description of the new order after the flood because the entire human race came from the three sons of Noah. The distinctions made here led to the dynamics of human relationships seen from this time forward in biblical history. This outlook on the distinctions among Noah's sons is confirmed by chapter 10, the distribution of Noah's sons. Looking to the generations which came along after the days of Noah, in Genesis chapter 10, Moses gave a sample listing of the places where the descendants of Ham, Shem, and Japheth went throughout the world. According to Genesis chapter 10, the Japhethites occupied territories to the north, northeast, and northwest of Canaan. With a few exceptions, the Hamites moved toward northern Africa, and the special son of Ham, namely Canaan, dwelled in the land of Canaan, Israel's promised land. The Shemites, or Semitic people, largely occupied the territories of the Arabian Peninsula. The record of Genesis chapter 10 is highly selective and designed to provide only general patterns of migration. But these general patterns were enough for Moses to illustrate some long-term patterns that characterized human interaction in the new order after the flood. Now that we have seen the literary structure of Moses' attention to Noah's sons in Genesis chapters 9 and 10, we're in a position to look at the second portion of the new order after the flood, the the defeat of the city of Babel in chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. The story of the Tower of Babel divides into 5 symmetrical dramatic steps. The first step of verses 1 and 2 begins with the vast majority of humanity together. But by contrast, this narrative ends in verses 8 and 9, where we learn that God dispersed humanity over the earth as he confused human language. Just how did humanity move from being together with one language to being scattered and having many languages? The middle portion explains what happened. The second step of verses 3 and 4 reports a plan which the people had. They intended to build a city with a great tower reaching to heaven so that they would be famous for all time and utterly invincible. Nevertheless, the fourth step of this narrative, in verses 6 and 7, balances this human plan by reporting God's counterplan. God called his heavenly army to attack the city by confusing the language of the people, and thereby to stop the construction of the city and its tower. The turning point of this story appears in verse 5, where God investigated the city and its tower. Once God saw the city and the proud plans of its inhabitants, he determined to bring an end to the city of Babel. So we see that according to Moses, life after the flood was far from the paradise we might have expected. On the contrary, the new order includes complex interactions among different groups of human beings. It also includes more defiance of God, as well as God's eventual defeat of those who defy him. Although these structures of the new order may seem strange to our modern ears, we will see that they spoke rather plainly to the experiences of the Israelites to whom Moses first wrote these chapters. Now that we have seen the literary structure of Genesis chapter 6, verse 9 through chapter 11, verse 9, we're in a position to ask a second question. Why did Moses write this account of the flood and the resulting new order? What lessons was he teaching the Israelites as they followed him toward the promised land?
Now that we've had time to look at the basic structure of the passages, let's see how we can apply some of the information in this lesson to our lives. Our first question is this: what does the flood story teach us about God? Please pause the video now to discuss. Our second question is this: what does the Babel story teach us about people? Please pause to discuss. We hope your time reflecting on this lesson helps you to see more of who God is and understand his grace for a sinful world.